don't have any questions about the midterm, but I just resubmitted my term paper assignment, but I accidentally did the exact same one again.
Okay.
Okay, I changed the name this time. If you could make like another submission.
I can. I'll do. Remind me to do that at the end of class, and I'll
Okay,
take it right there.
sorry about that.
It's fine. All right, questions about the midterm or about the term paper. I looked this morning and I saw that about 3 of them were submitted, so hopefully everyone had a chance to submit term paper assignment number 3B before class today. I'll be attempting to grade those swiftly because I believe the timeline is such that 2 weeks from now the revision will be due. So at the latest, I'll get it back to you within a week, but I will try to get it back to you more shortly than that, sooner than that.
For the what did we just turn in? For whatever we just turned in, the exam, do we have to answer the questions that you wrote, like comments?
No, so there's whatever grade you've received, that's the grade you're going to have. There's no, correcting the questions for more credit or anything like that. Right. Submitting the midterm submitted last week is what it is right now. Yep. All right. So then let's get on to the content for this week. So what were your impressions of what I presented? Because I feel like this can be a contentious topic to say that men and women, and you remember when we're talking about men and women, we're really talking about kind of the two ends of a spectrum where you got male typical traits on one side and you got female typical traits on the other side. Going back to our conversation about modularity and how people can vary on a continuum, that's the continuum we're using, at least for the purposes of talking about these sex differences. So I'm talking about kind of predominantly we see on average men tend to at least from the get-go have a proclivity to have certain types of psychological characteristics versus women tend to be higher on other certain psychological characteristics. So what do you all think of that idea? Any reactions to the content? Or more simply, what were your discussion questions? Oh, don't line up all at once. Don't make a sick man work harder than he needs to on this day. All right, let me stimulate. Here's a question that I receive a lot about sex differences. Should we even be acknowledging the differences between men and women? I mean, is it important to kind of go through and really document, okay, how do men and women differ on risk-taking, casual sex, preference for different kinds of toys, for et cetera, et cetera? I mean, is that even an important question? Should we be asking that?
I think that when it comes to that specifically, maybe for scientific purposes, I guess like it would be a good idea to look at those things, but I don't think like there's much of a benefit to just really look at that in like a scientific way, if that makes sense.
Interesting. That's an interesting point. Do y'all agree with that?
I agree. I feel like it shouldn't really be normalized.
So why shouldn't we be? So what scientific advantages do you see of studying these differences? So if you say that scientifically we should study them, I mean, where's the, I mean, the idea is that anything we scientifically study should, the results of any scientific study should ultimately inform how we design interventions, how we structure our society, how we make decisions. I mean, that is the purpose of doing this kind of research. So if you're saying we should research it, at least for the sake of knowledge, I mean, how are we going to use that knowledge?
One sec. Okay, so if, let's say we look at let's say men think, or women, let's say women think a certain way that can be beneficial in a certain job, for example. Let's say the women think a certain way that can be beneficial in a certain job. And with that, okay, yeah, and with that, if you look at it in a scientific way and figure that out, then I guess you could, like, it would be easier to appoint women to maybe that specific job, but either way they would still, oh, sorry, I'm not making my point clear. Okay.
No, that's fine. It's difficult
Okay,
to talk about,
so,
yeah.
Okay, let me start over, okay. Even if you look at it scientifically and you know why people act this way, I feel like they would still act the way they do, even if you did or did not look at it scientifically. Because nobody's gonna like start acting differently just because, like, oh, you're supposed to act this way because of your hormone. Do you know what I'm saying now, sort of? Yeah.
Right. So you're saying that just by virtue of knowing these things, it's not like people. So if we knew that, I don't know, women had a greater preference to care for anything that looks like a child, whether that's an actual child, whether those are animals, just caregiving tendencies, quote unquote, then we could say try to treat women as, or put them in these roles within society where they take care of things, right? But that doesn't mean that they actually will hold that desire. Is that what you're saying? Or that us knowing that isn't going to like change anyone's kind of preference if that happens to not be their preference.
Exactly. Yes, that's it. That is what I'm saying.
What do y'all think? What do y'all think of that idea of, well, if we know that on average men and women are psychologically different in certain ways, and then we know that, can we use that information? So if we can't use it, say, to assign people to roles, which first off, we can talk about why that's problematic. So first off, remember that we're talking about average differences between groups. And just because there is an average difference so let's say that you sample a bunch of men and a bunch of women, just you really spread it wide throughout the United States, and you sample, like, 100,000 men and 100,000 women, and you see, these differences between them on average. We can say that there are differences on average, but it's actually a fallacy to then take that data and say, well, given that that on average men tend to be, say, higher on risk taking, to then assume that an individual is higher, an individual man is higher on risk taking, is a fallacy, right? Because that person could actually be not typical for most men, right? They could actually individually be much lower on that trait compared to the average. So we do have to distinguish between average differences within the population. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how useful is it to know those averages, versus you can't really use those averages to infer anything about an individual, because an individual will potentially be different from average. So to say that, say if you're a manager, right? You're trying to hire someone for a job, and you're sitting there. You've got, you know, a male candidate and a female candidate, and the job is for babysitter, right? Let's say you're hiring a babysitter. If you have a male and a female candidate and they are perfectly equal in every way, it would be irrational. It wouldn't be correct. More than irrational, it wouldn't be correct to choose to hire the woman simply because women on average tend to have a preference for caregiving. Because we don't know if that individual woman happens to be high on caregiving, or if that man happens to be, say, above average than most other men on caregiving. So it's very possible that the individual is different from what would be the group average. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And I think that's kind of what you were getting at, Gonzalo, is that just because we know these average differences doesn't necessarily tell us anything about a given individual. Okay, so back to the question then, what is there any use to having this information if we can't infer things about individuals?
I could see it being helpful, like, I can see it give us the whys of why people act certain ways, or why we see certain common characteristics around the genders and the way they act.
I think it would be useful if it was to explain the behaviors of like a group of men or women, but as individually, like there's no use in using it to explain anything.
Yeah, by the way, I love the bird tweeting in the background. It sounds beautiful outside. Yeah, so okay, so we can describe then maybe trends within a group, right? In what situations would we need to be able to would it be useful to understand generally how men think or generally how women think or behave? Can we think of some like very specific examples of that?
You might be able to use it like in situations. I'm so sorry. In situations like if there's an event happening and you're trying to think about all of the things that could happen, you would probably say, well, if in this situation were to happen, then the men would act in this general behavior, and then the women would act in this behavior, I think.
Okay, yeah. So I'm trying to think of other situations. So let's take the gender label away, the sex and the gender label away, and let's talk about other situations where we try to characterize group behavior. I'm thinking of I'm trying to think of a very good example here. I don't know why my mind goes here, but one of the things I think about is maybe how we tend to group, this is probably a really bad example, but how we tend to group people who have committed crimes, right? People who break the law, is that we might want to identify a general group, if we could identify those who have a tendency to break certain laws, then we could use that information not to single out any given individual, but for example, to take into account the possibility that if I have a group of 100 people, and on average, they are going to be more likely to, say, break the law, then what I can do is I can assume that maybe I should be putting certain precautions in place to make sure that they can't break the law. So if you know, I mean, this is why we have, this is why you could have, say, any kind of law or regulation in place, is that, say, if someone's trying to, if you know that people are going to try to jaywalk, they're going to try to cross the street, because we just know that humans, on average, we know that all humans on average try to cut corners. We try to conserve energy where we can. And so if you're going to ask them to kind of sit at the edge of a kind of an intersection and ask them to like waste their precious time just sitting there, you know, not crossing the street before they walk over, what we're going to have to do is enforce that, because we know that if people were just left to their own devices, they'd just kind of cross the road whenever they want to. So if we can characterize human behavior on average, then certainly we can't single out any given individual, but we might be able to design interventions, or we might be able to provide people advice, or you know, put regulations in place that account for a general tendency. All right, let me give a much better example. Let's take the example of the observed sex difference in men's and women's response to different types of infidelity. So I mentioned that on average, men tend to become much more upset and tend to interrogate their partners much more vigorously about whether they have had sex with another person. So if you know, we're assuming heterosexual couple here, man with a woman. If the man's you know, female partner has had sex with, it has committed some kind of infidelity, the man not only will tend to focus on the sexual aspects of the infidelity, you know, first off, did you have sex with him? And did you enjoy yourself? Was it good? Was he better than me? It's almost like the focus is really on the sex itself. Versus on average for women tend to focus on kind of the emotional aspect of the infidelity. How much time are you spending with this person? Do you love them? You know, running through scenarios of are you going to leave me for them? Is this a person who you're going to actually, you know, say abandon me for example? So if we can see that on average, men's and women's anxieties tend to be a little bit different. Now, remember that there are more similarities between men and women than there are differences. But so when it comes to infidelity, both men and women are worried about their partner, you know, potentially leaving them. There's a lot of similarity there. But if we know that men tend to really focus on that sexual aspect of the infidelity, let's say that you go into a therapeutic session, a therapeutic context. You're getting relationship therapy. It could be that it would be helpful to know that men tend to think about that more as a clinician, as a therapist, because as you're addressing, say, the fallout of that infidelity, or of the partner having sex with someone else or falling in love with someone else, what might need to be done is you need to consider that on average, men might be thinking much more about the sexual interaction itself and their anxiety surrounding that, versus the woman may be dealing with a very different set of concerns, revolving more around kind of his ongoing investment in her, whether, you know, he's fallen in love with this other person. So we can't make assumptions about individuals, but what we can do with this information is perhaps use it to make educated guesses about what an individual, in this example, might be worried about, right? So I can't assume that the guy is more upset by the sexual element of the infidelity. But as a therapist, as a clinician, I might be able to say, okay, on average, he might be more upset by that. So I should bring this up in the therapy session. We should address this in case he is thinking about this. Or I should consider that the woman may be thinking very heavily about the emotional component, and so we should bring that up as well. So it's not that we make assumptions about the individual, but rather we use it as a guide to kind of to address things that we might not otherwise bring up if we were just to treat everyone exactly the same. Does that make sense? The kind of using it as a kind of a first line shortcut, you know, a diagnostic tool. Okay, is this what they're worried about? Let's probe into that deeper. If you then realize that's not what you're worried about, let it go, right? But use it as a diagnostic tool. That's one of the big advantages I see of at least being knowledgeable of differences that, for example, between men and women on average. Reactions to that?
I understand what you're saying, but I just don't know how to react to like what you're saying, because I understand it and I get it, like, and it makes sense to use it as a tool to kind of I don't know how to explain it. Never mind.
No, I appreciate you just kind of going and struggling with it, because I don't think this is a conversation that's like nailed down shut. If I could be convinced by someone that we should just be ignoring sex and gender differences, I am open to that possibility, but I have not heard a good argument for that yet. So what is it about? Yeah,
Okay. Sorry. If it's related to something else, so for example, when you're speaking about the infidelity and how men and women take it differently, I relate that to how, like, I mean, I feel like sometimes there are other influences too that, like, a person will respond differently to a situation. So how you grow up, like, if you were taught, oh, this is how you will act, because, like, that's just how it is for everyone who is like you, then you start to, like, if you grow up that way, you'll start to think that way all the time, and that's just how you will always react from then on.
gotcha. So like if you are told early on, hey, these differences exist, men act this way, women tend to act this way, that presumably over time you're actually going to internalize, I guess, that script, right?
Yes. And to further relate, um, like, my mom, she doesn't like certain things, and so that's how, like, she would always say that to us, and she would enforce it, like, if I did it to my sister or something like that, she'd be like, no, that's, like, I don't like that, you don't ever do something like that. And as I grew up, I just got used to it, so now I don't like the similar things.
Right. What do y'all think of that idea, that if we talk about differences between people, and I mean, let's we're focusing on sex and gender here, but I mean, we can take this broadly. If we focus on the differences between people, are we really just perpetuating those differences more than solving them, or I suppose addressing them? I think that there are situations where, so the idea that discussing sex and gender differences is going to perpetuate them. I'd actually like to go to, I'd like to talk about this article a little bit. I think that this is a very, so this article actually studied something that has been replicated. I subscribe to a lot of cross-cultural journals where, you know, they take things that traditionally have been studied in largely Western populations, and especially in undergraduate samples like college students, and they try to replicate them in other countries and other cultures with a much more diverse sample. And I've seen this again and again and again and again, is that, funnily enough, if you look at a country's level of gender egalitarianism, and that is basically it's a measure of what kinds of opportunities do men and women tend to, how equally do men and women have access to certain social opportunities like jobs and going to school, receiving an education, et cetera, you know, pursuing, kind of fulfilling their preferences as much as you'd see it in kind of a liberalized society is the kind of the focus on individual development. So in societies where there's more egalitarianism, that is, men and women have more equal opportunity, versus in societies where there's more gender inegalitarianism, where men and women tend to be kind of placed in certain roles, right? So if you're a woman, you tend to, you know, in most gender inegalitarian societies, you know, women are kind of pressed into that home caregiving, you know, in the home for caregiving, and then men tend to be kind of pushed into the workplace, and you have these very rigid gender roles. What we actually find is that if you measure these different features, these psychological, various psychological, this has been, I believe in here, it's looking at just risk and kind of, what do they look here? Risk, patience, altruism, reciprocity, which is just kind of, you know, giving and taking, and trust. But this applies to a lot of other psychological sex differences too. Turns out in the more egalitarian societies, that is where men and women have the freedom to really express themselves more freely, that have the opportunity to kind of pursue these non-gendered roles, you actually find that sex differences and gender differences are larger in egalitarian societies. Does anyone want to try and make sense of that? If you're living in a society where you are relatively free, you have the opportunity to kind of break out of those gender roles, go in whichever direction you want, we actually find that men and women tend to have larger differences in their psychology. How can we possibly explain that?
I think it's more in the availability of the, or not availability, the ability to even be able to explore. And so in countries where there's no, in countries where it's different from, say, like here in the United States, you not being able to like have those opportunities takes away the differences between sexuality, I feel like.
Okay, so like if you're kind of put into these rigid roles, then you're really only going to see people in those roles. Versus if people are free to do whatever they want, they're going to gravitate to, I don't know, they're going to gravitate in a way that actually might exaggerate those differences. Is that
Yes.
Yeah. Any other comments on this, or kind of thoughts on why we see greater sex differences and gender differences in egalitarian societies? Does this surprise anybody?
So
I was just gonna say, you could go ahead.
sorry. So when you say egalitarian, you mean like economically egalitarian, correct? Like not just a societally egalitarian.
It's a composite measure, and it depends on the study, because different studies quantify it in different ways. But economically, that is, men and women have relatively equal access to certain kinds of jobs. They might be freer to pursue social roles that are outside of kind of a rigid structure. So that is, there's not a, it's economic, but it's also sociocultural. It's more of, people do not necessarily have strong expectations for men and women to be in certain roles within that society. And economically, it seems that they are not pressed that way either. So both. I think this one was just economically, so for the purposes of this article, yeah, economically.
Okay, yeah, and like that was sort of my only real comment on it, was that, economic freedom is not necessarily society, just because you may have the freedom to choose what you want to do economically and still make a living, there still may be a societal expectation that influences that that role that's not necessarily like biologically driven. Yeah.
So if they're economically more egalitarian, but let's assume that, socioculturally, you still got a lot of hangups here. You still got a lot of barriers for people to express themselves however they wish. Why would the gender differences get larger if people are more economically egalitarian? Because it's not just that they're staying the same. It's not that, things are equal across these. It's actually that you see greater differences in more egalitarian societies.
Right. So if we're focusing on the economic aspect of it and just, the economic freedom, then you can make the argument that there's a greater difference because there's a greater pressure to conform because there's no reason not to conform, right? So in a society where you're expected to pursue wealth, maybe women aren't expected to be like in the boardroom, but overall that's fine because they're making money and we value that as a society. But like if they have, this ability to make equal money, well then you may say, well, why are you doing this? This is not a gender thing. You can go do this other thing and still be fine economically. So why are you doing this male thing?
I think I sort of follow what you're saying, but I don't know if I entirely understand the logic. So what is then causing the greater gender difference in that scenario? So people are, so you have, let's say that economic egalitarianism looks like women have the opportunity to make money. In that situation, I would actually expect that if people are just kind of filling whatever opportunity is available to them, you'd actually see, to the extent that, say, making money, both men and women would then be pursuing that goal, you'd actually expect them to be more similar, because maybe, the personality that makes a lot of money and maybe does so like hawkishly, I would expect everyone would kind of cluster around that personality. So I guess I don't see in that scenario where the gender differences get larger, or men and women actually diverge more.
Yeah. So like, let's say we have a job that is, like teaching is generically considered to be like a feminine job, right? And you have teaching and you have versus like being a mechanic. And let's say they both pay the same amount, the same rates. And so there would not necessarily be an economic reason for a woman to be a mechanic, because she could go be a teacher and make the same amount of money, right? And so the only influence there necessarily would be, well, some level of personality, but also of society, would basically, like you said, oh, I want it to be a mechanic. Well, then she might be shamed for wanting to do this male thing when she could do something that is more in line with the expectations given to her, even though, because they make the same amount of money,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I actually do understand what you're saying. So to the extent that people are making the same amount of money, there's no reason to kind of like to artificially go one way or another just for the money, because we're all getting paid equally. That's so economic egalitarianism wouldn't be that, though. So it's not equal pay. It's that people have equal opportunity to pursue different career opportunities, to pursue different careers. So it's not that teachers in gender egalitarian societies, you don't see, unfortunately, teachers just don't make a lot of money, no matter where you go, at least relative to the most lucrative jobs. So that wouldn't be what it is. That wouldn't be how it is. this is more, again, equal opportunity. That is, given given how schooling works, given how people tend to fit so schooling, employment decisions, that is how many men and women are represented in different types of jobs. So it's more about opportunity and then representation within different sectors of the economy, rather than the pay being equal or more equalized. So I guess, well, Manietta, you had something that you wanted to say. What were you going to add, if you can still reach back there?
I was just gonna say with I guess economically I was just gonna add maybe, resources, maybe things that they're allowed to get. I was just gonna say in any society, being that one is already, egalitarian, regardless of the fact you still gonna have like the basic norms like guys are supposed to do this, women are supposed to do this, you have like the supposed to aspect of it. So I don't think it's really ever gonna be like completely equal, just in the basic areas like jobs, like women can take on things that guys, were doing in the past, but I feel like it's always going to be that, social norm there saying, hey, you're supposed to do this, and hey, you're supposed to do this. You understand?
Yeah, I do get that. I mean, I think that's right, is that as much as we might strive to equalize men's and women's positions within society, I think that there is something kind of continuing to keep roles relatively rigid. I mean, I think expectations have loosened a little bit. That is, I think that men and women are fairly equally encouraged to pursue certain things, but then as you get further along in the process, you then see some other biases coming out, where, say, if an employer has the belief that men tend to, so first off, men are not going to get pregnant, and this is something big that I think everyone should think about, is employers will often think about men and women differently, largely because women can get pregnant, and some can see that as a liability. So they may not hire a woman just because they think, well, you know what, one day she's going to have a child, and I'm just going to have to pay. I'm going to have to find a replacement for her. I'm going to have to do all this extra work. And so I think that would be an example, right? Is that's just kind of a, even if you have equal opportunity, eventually you might have people still discriminating men and women, just kind of based on those kinds of differences. Yeah, is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So this, I still haven't, I mean, so we still haven't really answered though why. So if these barriers are still going to exist, right, is that no matter how hard we work towards egalitarianism, there's always going to be some inequality between men and women in terms of potentially how they're treated by people, socially, how we handle men and women. But it still doesn't describe why in an egalitarian society, the difference would be greater. And the explanation I've seen, and that I tend to buy into, and that I can't see a significantly better explanation, is that when you free people to pursue whatever they want, then what they'll probably do is pursue whatever their preferences are. So if I mean, there's a world where you live in a society and they say, okay, men do this, women do that, and they get put into these very particular roles based on what culture dictates, what tradition dictates, perhaps even, in some places what law can dictate. But in an egalitarian society, whatever you individually prefer to do, you can work towards that, and you can be that person. You can be, that kind of work, that you can have that kind of job. And so the argument is that to some degree, we're going to see that men and women have different preferences from very early on. Does that mean that all men and women do? But if we're looking at groups, no. But if we're looking at groups, then on average, we actually should see that in egalitarian societies, women are probably going to drift towards doing the things that they prefer, and men are probably going to drift towards doing the things that they prefer. And one of the differences that we see is that on average, women do tend to gravitate towards people-oriented jobs. And that could be very broadly defined. I mean, we can talk about, you know, things like human resources. We can talk about nursing. There are far more women in nursing than there are men, although I think that is equalizing to some degree, but you still see an overrepresentation of women. I mean, I think that honestly what we'll see is public servant jobs in general are probably going to be eventually, as we open up politics to more women, just make it more diverse in general, I think we're hopefully going to see more women in politics, because that is in a way, public service, being a politician should really be about serving people, right? And so if that's a people-oriented job, versus men tend to gravitate towards what are called system-oriented jobs. That is things where, so I mentioned in the lecture about differences between kind of a systematizing mind versus, oh my God, the term is escaping me. I apologize. It's system-oriented versus basically people-oriented. And the system-oriented, a systematizing mind tends to potentially get lost in, say, physically, mechanically, how things fit together. Sounds good. Thanks, Gonzalo. Physically, how things fit together. And so when you look at like the tradition of men being really interested in cars or being really interested in engineering, which you do see, they're just overrepresented. There are lots of men in engineering, even in engineering programs where there are actual programs specifically dedicated to encouraging women to be in engineering. You still see a lot more men there. So you might see that men are just they have a preference towards these system-oriented jobs. And so if you open it up and everyone has equal opportunity, people are going to do what they want to do, what they like. And so the idea is that the gender differences will actually get larger, because there must be something else kind of driving men and women towards these different roles, towards their preferences. Now we can talk about what's causing those preferences. I'm not necessarily arguing that every bit of a person's preference comes from some aspect of their biology, or, you know, either the genes or the various, you know, cocktails of hormones that ultimately lead to differences between men and women. There can also be, I think, cultural influences of a person's preference, but I don't think that we can ignore the biological aspect. I think it's going to be a little bit of both. What do y'all think of that? So that's the idea, is open up society, give more opportunities, and people are going to kind of follow their preferences.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that, and I think even in my original argument, I wasn't even necessarily negating the preference idea of it all. I think ultimately the question is sort of what ultimately dictates his influences, and I think that's sort of where I personally diverge from the biological aspect of it. Obviously, there's some. I mean, you know, I'm not going to negate biology altogether. I just think it is, and the way I look at things, it is back burner to society at large.
Was it Chikara? I think you were going to say, or who else opened their mic? Someone was going to say something.
Sorry, it was by accident.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Yeah, and that really is the essential question, is if we can acknowledge that there is a biological contribution and a sociocultural contribution to the development of every single aspect of who we are, which is something that we actually do know. I don't get into twin studies very much in this class, but one of the ways that we can really break apart what proportion of a trait tends to be genetically or biologically influenced versus environmentally influenced is that you can take people who are 100% genetically identical, that is, identical twins. And if they get raised in different environments versus if they're raised in the same environment, you can calculate how much of the differences between those twins tends to be due to their shared genes versus aspects of their environment. And typically they distinguish two things. There's the shared environment, things like family, so if you're raised in the same household, and the non-shared environment, that is your personal individualized experiences, say with your friend groups, with where you end up moving in your life, stuff like that. And so we know actually from these studies that there is a genetic and there is an environmental component to absolutely every trait. I mean, their twin studies are very well funded. There are several institutes that do them, and they keep finding kind of the same. I mean, they're very rigorous, like experimental, placebo-controlled designs. They kind of test different capacities of differences between twins, and the evidence is very convincing in my mind. So we know that exists. So the question then lies, well, to what degree is biology or genes? I want to get away from the term biology, because biology can actually be environmental too. When you're exposed to hormones are a type of environment, right? So really, we're talking about the contribution of genes specifically, and to what degree is the environment or the sociocultural aspects shaping all of that. Did anyone, so I think in the lectures I very briefly mentioned a study on vervet monkeys. And it was a study of toy preferences. And I find that one of so to describe the study again, I don't remember exactly how much detail I go into in the lecture, but the idea is that they took vervet monkeys and they looked at male and female vervet monkeys, and then what they did was they presented them with an array of potential toys to play with. And the two toys that kind of stood out as being really enjoyed by these vervet monkeys was a car. That is a car that is like a toy car that you could like roll around, that you could physically move around, and there the wheels would spin, and et cetera, et cetera. And then this doll that looked very humanoid, right? It just looked like a baby stuffed doll. And what they actually found was that male vervet monkeys, although both male and female tended to explore both the car and the doll, what you ended up finding is that eventually, given enough time, the male vervet monkeys would spend more time playing with the toy car as opposed to the doll, whereas the female vervet monkeys would eventually spend more time with the doll and actually engaging in behavior that was kind of nurturant, right? And this is considered this is an interesting study, just because I think one of the sociocultural element, although it is not unique to humans, it is highly developed in humans, and is relatively less developed in other primates. And so to see this preference arise for playing with certain types of toys in vervet monkeys is really kind of perplexing. I mean, I'm not sure we can really make the argument that sociocultural factors are shaping vervet monkeys' preferences for a toy car versus a doll. So what do y'all think of that? I mean, in terms of how do we explain that difference of kind of preference for one thing or another? By the way, the logic for the male vervet monkeys enjoying the toy car is that the car actually had several kind of moving parts to it. And so the idea is that the vervet monkeys would actually like roll it around and watch it and try to push it, and it would like clash against a wall, and they would be like testing out its physical features. Once again, the idea is that it might be tapping into this kind of underlying preference, this underlying systematizing mind, this kind of preference for interacting with physical objects that you tend to see more common within human males as well. So I don't know. Any reactions to that? I mean, I can actually find that study. I think it's a little unfair of me to just describe it and not give it to you, but I'll see if I can find that and send it out. Any reactions to that, though? I mean, how do we? That seems like good evidence for a genetic component to a preference difference that exists between men and women. And it seems like it could be applied to humans as well, to the degree that we do tend to have male toys and female toys. I think there's a lot about toys that tends to be dictated by our culture, but I do think that there is an underlying component to certain types of toys that might be more preferred by default by men versus women.
I thought it was a pretty interesting study because to see how monkeys and humans are often like related through science, and so to see it in like behaviors of animals that aren't humans and but closely resemble us was interesting.
Yeah. This question of culture versus genes. So I think that I will say this, where I've landed on this right now is that the distinction between genes and environment, I think, is to a great degree artificial. I think that our genes influence our environment, and I think our environment influences our genes. It's all kind of one. I mean, it's really hard to truly tease those things apart. And so how I see, for example, things like sociocultural differences between men and women arising is I think that there was, perhaps originally and still is to some degree, a biological basis for some of the differences that we observe in culture. So for example, if we know that on average, men, just by virtue of being exposed to more testosterone, throughout, during puberty and then throughout life, they tend to have an easier time putting on muscle mass, kind of developing larger bodies. They tend to, they develop kind of lower pitched voices, things like that. And so if you have this larger body and this kind of ability to project your voice really far, just having those abilities is probably going to, imagine it in an ancestral environment. I'm not talking about modern environments. I'm talking about what most of human history has been. Imagine that you have those characteristics and you live within a certain group. That group probably involuntarily is going to be like, hey, listen, you're really strong and you're really loud. We're going to put you in the group that is responsible for being a warrior, right? We actually want you to like train to do combat so you can protect the village or you can protect our group. They may have had very little say in that, right? So it's almost like the biological features that lead into kind of the physical differences between men and women. Those physical differences may have given rise to some of the culture of the gender roles that are then attributed to men and women. Versus if women, they get pregnant, they have to take care of they have to gestate the child for 9 months. It comes out, and then what we also know about childbirth is that there tends to be this rush of the hormone called oxytocin, which is a bonding chemical. It tends to help people feel connected to another thing, whether that's a partner. And in this case, in the case of giving birth, what we find is that if you give the child to the mother directly after childbirth, that oxytocin rush tends to contribute to her feelings of closeness to that infant. This is actually why in the past they used to do it such that the mother would give birth, and then they'd take the child away from the mother and isolate the child in a different room to give the mother a break. What they found out is that that was a really bad idea, because the mother was feeling this oxytocin rush. She was kind of prepared to feel, to have this bonding moment. And then there was no baby to bond with. And so you actually found that women who gave birth that way tended to report feeling more distant from their child, having more of postpartum depression, that is depression that comes as a consequence of right after giving birth. So they started giving children back to their mothers so that they can capitalize on that oxytocin rush. So the idea is there is a kind of biological mechanism that is meant to bond the mother to the child. So it could be that to the degree that the mother and the child do bond in that moment by virtue of this biological event, this oxytocin, it could be that women just kind of preferred to be in that role because they're bonded to this thing now. They really like it. They have formed this relationship with it. And so now they might even self-select into that role. And then the rest of society is looking at them like, you know what, women seem to like to do this. They seem to, really enjoy kind of taking care of children. Let's just make that role for them. And so I think that there is an interplay here where there's a biological component that then can lead into society expecting certain things of you by virtue of that biological component. Now, suffice it to say, that is very different from saying that that's how it should be. And I think that that's one of the good things about modern society, is that we've progressed to the point where just because, for example, a guy might be really, largely built and would be a good warrior, doesn't mean we should be pushing him into that role. Because being a warrior, being in the military, right, is a very risky endeavor. So to expect men to be in the military and not expect, and just kind of put them there and then keep women out, not only hurts the woman because if she wants to be in the military, she's not allowed to be, but also potentially hurt men more often because they're being pushed into these really, really risky roles without their consent. So we've gotten away from doing that. But I think that the roles were shaped in the first place by some of the biological differences that we observe between men and women. Do you see that logic applying to something else, or how do you feel? Yeah, it's up.
Well, I had something to say about the military thing. So I'm not into politics or anything, but do you know if they're starting to draft women and men equally yet, or is it just still men?
Well, the draft hasn't been implemented since the 60s or something. It's been a while. So the draft, no one's being drafted. But if there were a draft, I want to say that there actually was a resolution passed. I want to say it was a couple of years ago. I need to check into this. I believe, though, men and women would be both drafted now. It used to be that they wouldn't. And yeah, in the military, both men and women are allowed to be in it, and they're not allowed to be restricted from it. Whereas before they were, yeah. I don't know the exact state of that law. I'm not sure if it was a bill that never got passed or whether it was actually passed and now the draft would be for both men and women. I want to say it actually passed, but we can look into that.
I'll look it up later.
I want to, so I think it's important to think about these things, because if we recognize that there might be some genetic component to how society has been structured, I think that it kind of reveals how we might also dismantle the worst practices that we have, right? So for example, if trying to think of a really solid example here. If men are if we know that, for example, men are being drafted more often, or that men are kind of being pushed into the role. Okay, really good example is of men of not expecting men to cry, right? If by virtue of men's stature and their generally being larger and they develop muscle mass more quickly because of the circulating testosterone, stuff like that, if we know that that's contributing to why we treat men differently, then having that knowledge equips us to say, okay, the only reason that this role exists, that this gender role exists, is because we're just kind of blindly following the logic of biology, right? Is we just think that men should be kind of tough, and they shouldn't cry, and they should be in the military, and they should be doing risky jobs, and they should be making more money because, you know, they might kind of have certain qualities that we, you know, that you'd want in a leader, right? That you want, you know, a strong leader, that you want someone with a, you know, dominant, deep voice, stuff like that. If you realize that that's why you're pushing men into those categories, you can start to kind of tease apart why that might be faulty logic, especially in a modern environment. Maybe way back when, it was important to have the strongest, kind of biggest built people as the quote unquote warrior class, right? But we don't really need that in a modern society anymore, right? What we care about, especially in democratic societies, is, can you negotiate with people? Can you diplomatically resolve conflict rather than physically getting into a fight with somebody? So maybe men, I mean, in that context, it doesn't really make sense to elevate men to greater positions of power or even into positions of the military by virtue of them just being bigger and having deeper voices. Now our priorities have changed. So I think if we realize that people might be, I mean, people might just, we know this is that, for example, I'll make this very real. Male teachers tend to have much better student evaluations than female teachers. And the idea is that to some degree, just simply having like wide shoulders, deep voice, kind of having that traditional role of being like a male can actually give you the advantage of kind of people thinking that you're more competent, that you're a better leader, right? And so there's this kind of natural tendency to just assume that kind of large, deep voice people tend to be good leaders. If you can recognize that you kind of have that instinctual bias, then you can try to change, and that instinctual bias has led to a certain culture. By acknowledging it, you can figure out a better way to dismantle that culture or to get rid of that cultural tradition if it turns out to be a bad one, or if it turns out to be one that's simply not applicable within society anymore. Does that make sense? In my mind, that makes sense, that this knowledge kind of helps us to shape society more effectively, rather than being ignorant of that and then just being confused when you know, men are promoted positions of power and being like, well, why are they doing that? Well, people are perhaps just being swayed by a deep voice when deep voices don't really mean that much. Don't mean that much in a modern society anyway. I guess to kind of come back to our original question, why even acknowledge these differences? I think that these differences are influencing, they are shaping kind of how culture plays out. And so I'm all for shaping culture to maximally serve the purpose that we need it to serve. I think that, you know, society should be more gender egalitarian. But in order to achieve gender egalitarianism, I think we need to be conscious, we need to be aware of the genetic component that contributes to how our culture plays out. If you're not aware of that, you might be attempting to change something in a way that is ultimately going to be effective because it doesn't take into account every single factor. All right, how's that idea landing? I have 4 minutes. I want to stop talking, and I kind of want to hear what you guys have to say. I want to remind you, these are simply my opinions. These are my thoughts based on I think some of this material that I'm presenting and some of the evidence I'm presenting, but my mind is very open. If you fundamentally disagree with some assumption I'm making, I actually would love to hear it.
No, I mean, I agree with basically pretty much everything you said. I think there is, you know, a biological basis to a lot of these differences. I think to sort of relate it back to something that Gonzalo and Hannah said earlier was this idea of like, once we start to point them out, they become much more exacerbated. And I think that's sort of the cautionary tale in all of this is sort of like it becomes a cycle, right? Where you point out differences and then you sort of like snowball them into becoming more and more different, even if they're not necessarily that important at the end of the day.
So how do we acknowledge them and factor them in without talking about them? Because I think there's a fine line to that. So I understand that argument. So that means that there's a fine line here, right? Is when should we talk about it and when shouldn't we?
Right, and I don't have an answer to that, to be honest. Again, that's a very complex question. I think there are right times and places for a lot of these things, right? Like clearly in an academic setting, it's totally fine to talk about differences because the context is there. It's understood that this is like a academic, you know, analysis, and it's not. But like if you're a policymaker, that's not something you should probably like. You know, then you should be taking it in a different understanding, right? And I think it's extremely contextual.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, one of the contexts that I think I introduced to you guys is that, you know, we're talking about group differences, we're talking about averages, and we can't infer things about individuals based on averages. I emphasize that there are more similarities than there are differences. And so I think that those are some of the details that get lost to a lot of people, is that people start talking about, oh, men and women are so different. And then if you really step back, well, yeah, there are differences, and some of those differences are significant. They're important to recognize, but there are a lot more commonalities, right? And I think we don't acknowledge that enough, and people don't even realize that. From Mars, you know, women are from Mars, some Venus, all that, whatever that garbage is. That's what's popular, right? And so that just demolishes the nuance or the context for the conversation. I think if there were more context and people were aware of that context, I think it would be safer to talk about these things. It would at least be more productive to talk about them. All right. That is everything. We're out of time. So everything should be posted for next week. I will, again, look at your term papers sometime before next week. Hopefully I feel better soon. And yeah, have a wonderful time. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for being here.
Can you remember to open another submission
Yes.
link?
Thank
This
you. I
time
will.
I changed the name. I changed the name on it.
Sounds good. Thanks,
Okay.
Giselle.
Bye.